Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's faculty conversation. Just as a quick reminder, these faculty conversations will take place via Zoom every Monday at 12:15. You'll have an opportunity to hear from LBJ faculty and get to learn more about their background, courses, research, community involvement, PRPs, and more. At the end of each session, you'll have an opportunity to ask any questions. At today's faculty conversation, we get to speak to Professor Peniel Joseph. Professor Joseph, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, great. I guess at this stage, I'm just going to pass it over to you, and so we can get to know a bit more about your background and the work that you do at the LBJ School.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for organizing these and everybody for attending. Yeah, my name is Peniel Joseph, and I'm the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School. And I'm also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, and I'm a professor of history. I've been here for 5 years now. I've been in the space of social justice since I was 6. I'm 48 now. And being in picket lines in New York City with my Haitian mother, who's 81. So I never expected to be a professor. I grew up in a household raised by a Haitian feminist who was also a Pan-Africanist, revolutionary, hospital worker, trade unionist. So I've been in demonstrations in New York City, Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan, my whole life, demonstrations against police brutality, promoting Black history, against the mistreatment of Haitian immigrants, especially during the AIDS, HIV crisis of the 1980s. Just the whole gamut. So that's, in a lot of ways, I later found out I had kind of an unusual childhood. I thought that's what everybody did. My mother speaks 4 languages. So she speaks Spanish and French and Haitian and English. So we also had Puerto Rican and Dominican radicals and revolutionaries around us. So we were always for Puerto Rican independence, in addition to Haitian liberation. So, by way of just introduction, I never expected to be in the space of higher education as like a scholar. And so I say that on purpose because a lot of times the people I've met, and I've been now in the academy for 30 years as a student and professor, they're definitely coming to higher education from a completely different background. For me, some people are multiple generations of college and privilege and stuff. Most of these folks have been white, but I've met Black and people of color who are from these privileged backgrounds too. And I don't say that to denigrate them, but they think about scholarship and activism and policy and history in much different ways than I do. So I never expected to be a tenured professor. I didn't know what endowed chairs were. I didn't know what a university endowment was. I've learned all of this through being around for 3 decades. But when I meet students who really want to be engaged in social activism, I can definitely relate because when I went to state school, State University in New York at Stony Brook, only reason I could afford school was because it was a state school. I had no intentions of going beyond my dual degree of history and Black studies until being mentored by Black and African and white professors who were encouraging me to go on to graduate school. So I finished undergrad in 3 years and went straight into a PhD program while still doing political work in Philadelphia in defense of Mumia Abu-Jamal, in defense of MOVE and really Black radicals in Philadelphia in the 90s. Really rough times in Philadelphia. Philadelphia, in North Philadelphia, where I lived and went to grad school, was burnt out. It looked like you were in Fallujah or Afghanistan or somewhere. It was worse than New York City. North Philadelphia had been abandoned and wrecked by not just deindustrialization, but by just these racist policies of segregation and immiseration and impoverishment, unequal schools. So it did work there in Philly as well. But then I think I became convinced through working with professors like Sonia Sanchez and others who had been long, long marchers in the Black freedom struggle, that I could be a scholar and be an activist, that I could leverage whatever knowledge I was gaining as sort of this lifelong student. I'm still a student, even though I'm a professor now, and I could do all these extraordinary things. And so in that sense, my work on the Black Power movement has been very deeply personal for me, because it was a way to think about politics, to think about democracy, from the lens of people who were usually marginalized. So these were folks who were Black revolutionaries, folks who were part of the carceral state, who had been incarcerated. So, whether it's Angela Davis or George Jackson or Malcolm X, these are people who have been in prison. Joanne Little. Black feminism, I've been in the space of Black feminism since I was a boy, but certainly as an intellectual since the last 27 years. This is year 28, and really learning about the work of Ida B. Wells and Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth and Mariah Stewart and Anna Julia Cooper and Nannie Helen Burroughs and Lorraine Hansberry and Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith and the Conby River Collective, Angela Davis. Contemporaries are Brittany Cooper and Tressie McMillan Cottom and Roxane Gay and Keisha Blaine and so many others, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Darlene Clark Hine. But the whole notion of Kimberly Crenshaw, of course, critical race theory, and the whole notion of intersectionality in terms of both issues and identity, and how that relates to policy. So, in a lot of ways, the work that I do is informed by history and the academy, but it's really informed by deep study of social movements. And I consider active citizenship something that intrinsically is anti-racist, is anti-sexist, is deeply anti-patriarchal. I'm writing a piece on Ice Cube right now, a critique of Ice Cube and not the contract with Black America per se, but just his ability to be utilized by the Trump administration. There's something deeply patriarchal about that in this BLM moment, about not being ready to support the leadership of these Black women who are part of BLM and have really, even beyond Black, when you think about revolutionary Chicana feminisms and indigenous feminisms, they are intersectional. If you read Benita Roth's Our Separate Roads to Feminism, if you read just the work of women of color in a global feminist space, Chandra Mohanty and others, it's very, very important. And I think, I'm pushing back against, I understand, I think Cube is very, very well intentioned, but it still follows a Moynihan report that pathologizes the Black family, demonizes Black women, and is constantly trying to recenter straight Black men, when straight Black men's issues, and I'm a straight Black man, absolutely are important, but we're not the most important. Everybody is the most important, and you get that by centering other people than yourself. That's how you do it. But that's hard. That's hard. This is the real work, and I think that's what King meant when he was talking about the beloved community. A lot of it is shared struggle and shared sacrifice, but everybody has some vision of privilege that it would be hard to sacrifice, including those of us who are not, food insecure. You might have some other problems and you're vulnerable because of race, because of gender, because of any other issues, but there are parts of your identity just by being on a Zoom call that have privilege, because just not everybody in the world can be on a Zoom call, even though it feels like it. It actually feels like it. Right now, it feels like, hey, normal, everybody in our life, we have a computer that's powerful enough. We've got internet and Wi-Fi, and we just got a schedule where other things are happening, where the lights are still on, our homes are still fine, and we can Zoom. But I can tell you, our data shows us that there are millions and millions of people who actually don't have this, and they don't have Wi-Fi, just in the United States, let alone globally. So there are people, and there's finally some stories coming, about this, and not just from left sites like Heckinger's and things that I read, but the Wall Street Journal and other places. So, I'll stop there. I'll say just a tiny bit. The Center for the Study of Race and Democracy, what we do is we're interested in race and democracy and vulnerability. So we're interested in voting rights. We're interested in unemployment. We're interested in desegregation. We've had folks, we're interested in incarceration in Travis County, but also nationally in criminal justice reform. So we have a fellowship program. So we have undergraduate and graduate fellows. We have 23 this year. And they do research that is designed to impact policy, impact a discussion, be of use to nonprofits and social justice and other orgs that are especially locally, because I think that we need more of that work right here in Texas and in Austin. We have a podcast. We have a Race and Democracy podcast where we get some exciting guests. That's weekly. We do a lot of events. We've been doing them virtually. The next one is going to be this Thursday with former Dallas Mayor and Ambassador Ron Kirk about the power of the vote. But we just did one with Eric Tang about gentrification in Austin. And we've held some stuff with the mayor earlier, right after George Floyd, when the protests first started around June 1st. So we really had no summer off this summer because of what's been going on. And we're interested in a lot because we're interested in race and how it connects with medicine, how it connects with law, how it connects with the environment, how it connects in a panoramic way. I mean, our school still doesn't have like a race and policy course, which I think is a disgrace. And I've told the faculty and all these folks this, and we're working on it, but certainly it should have happened way before. Race is central to all policy, especially US policy. Even if you disagree with the premise of the 1619 Project, as early as 1776, we can see race is central because the Declaration and the Constitution does not apply to all because of racial slavery and the fact that women also, all women can't vote. White women get the vote in 1920. Black men get the vote for a few years in 1870, just for a short time. And then white women in 1920, and then Black women in 1965. So, policy is a huge part of this, but we don't, at the LBJ school, and it's ironic because obviously LBJ, one of his biggest policy legacies is the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act. And the Great Society does do things to enhance racial justice as well. So, but with that being said, I'll just open it up. Yeah.
Please raise your hand, and I urge you to just tell us what your questions are, if any.
Okay.
Hi, Dr.
Joseph.
I am curious about really sparked off of your last point and about the sort of I've heard a lot of conversations about like the democratic project in America and particularly how that's under threat, and I always find that phrase interesting because the original democratic project is not the same one that I think that we think of now.
Yeah.
It was obviously very limited and did not include the majority of people living on the continent at the time that now consists of the United States. So I guess my question is, how do you see that democratic project? I feel like there is in some ways a reclamation that has happened. I think like President Obama is big on this and reclaiming the story of American democracy and using it to tell one of expanded political rights. But I feel like, in the way that we're in a retrenchment from that, I'm just curious of how you see that narrative and how we can make sense of that kind of rhetoric in the time that we're facing today.
Yeah, you know, I think there are always been competing narratives of American democracy and that democratic project. Certainly, its first iteration is very, very narrow. You know, maybe 6% of people can vote in the first election in terms of, you know, how it happens, who can vote. It's a representative democracy. It's indirect democracy. Uh, the Three-Fifths Compromise is both a reflection of racial slavery, but it also distorts the democratic process. So does the U.S. Senate, you know, so does the Supreme Court. So much of this is, sometimes we say it's designed to diffuse authoritarianism, but that's not really true. It's really designed to diffuse participatory democracy. That being said, there's been transformations, and different people have different competing democratic projects, including racial justice movements, probably especially racial justice movements, because even more than mainstream white feminist movements, racial justice movements, because a lot of times the participation of Black women have really called for the most expansive democracy that you can have, right? And you know, I do think that part of the reason why the democratic project is imperiled is that you're still beholden to long-standing institutions that are inherently anti-democratic. And that includes the Supreme Court, that includes the US Senate. Um, it includes, look at the politics over voting in the country and the right to vote. Look at the politics over the census and the census data. So on some levels, I think that right now, the 21st century is interesting because I think in previous iterations, and you saw this in the 19th century with the Civil War and after, and you saw it in the 20th century during the Civil Rights Movement's heroic period, there was a sense that you could go to long-standing institutions to try to get structural change or transformation. So you have one Supreme Court in 1857 that says Dred Scott is not a citizen, it's not a human being, you know. Then you have a civil war and you have these amendments, but then by 1896, you have a Supreme Court that says separate but equal is constitutional, right? I mean, those things show you that, well, the democratic project is not real in the United States of America, right? But then you have other people who are pushing, who are protesting, doing social movements, still going through the courts, and they get victories. The Brown decision, and forget the Brown decision for a second, 1954. 1950 for us is the real game changer in Texas, because that's the Heman Sweat decision that allows Heman Sweat to become the first Black law student. Doesn't graduate from UT Law, because the school's too racist to graduate from in 1950 to 53. He actually leaves, but certainly he sets up a context for the first Black undergraduates in 1956 to enroll. We sometimes call them the precursors, right? But subsequent to Heman Sweat and Brown and these different decisions, even the Roe v. Wade decision, what you see is that the courts can also turn, right? So the courts themselves are not just neutral, objective arbiters of justice, which again, inherently, even if you get, that's why I always tell people, even if you got your 9-0 Supreme Court and all the federal and all the appellate, the reason why, irrespective of ideology, it's bankrupt is because the process is bankrupt. You see what I'm saying? And I'll repeat that. So the reason why it's bankrupt, right, is that the process is bankrupt. There's no trustworthy, I would say, in our democracy right now, there is no trustworthy way to put anyone on the Supreme Court. Do you see what I'm saying? There's no way, which means that that institution is bankrupt, right? And so, you know, I would probably say that, you know, court appointees need term limits, but there probably needs to be some kind of other mechanism. I'm not even necessarily saying elections, because we have elections here in Texas, and that's not great. Judges getting elected is not great. But I'd say there needs to be some kind of mechanism where there was buy-in and a consensus on how to do that. So the process is bankrupt. Voting rights here you get the Voting Rights Act, but then 2013, you get a court because of ideological reasons that upends the voting rights, right? So I do think that the democratic project is imperiled, but I think that there are also competing versions and visions of this democratic project, and I think when you think about um, Angela Davis, when you think about Malcolm X, Audre Lorde, when you think about other folks, they're going to have their own different visions. Cesar Chavez for a time, right? Dolores Huerta, there's going to be different visions when you think about trans activists, Muslim activists, queer folks, women, Black women, so non-able-bodied. So it's deeper than that. But I do think that 2020 has been very, very important in terms of casting a spotlight on the fact that a lot of what we think of as aberrations to the democratic project are not. It's how it's intended to work. So voter suppression is absolutely a part of American democracy. I think the positive of this year and the Democratic Project is pushing back. And a great book that people should read is the Eddie Glaude book, Begin Again, about James Baldwin. And not only the 60s, but our time as well. James Baldwin's urgent lessons for his own time and our own. Because I think that's a great book, short book, very well done. I just did a podcast with Eddie Glaude, who's a professor at Princeton, really brilliant. But it pushes back against the idea of American exceptionalism, right? This idea, and when you think about American exceptionalism, this idea that somehow the United States of America um, uh, uh, has achieved its rhetoric of democracy and is just constantly trying to perfect the union. Honestly, you mentioned Barack Obama. Barack Obama wins in large parts by amplifying that rhetoric of American exceptionalism, really to both his credit, but also we can critique him for that too, because it is so aspirational and it doesn't exist. It's a big letdown when people find out that it doesn't exist. So politically, it was the right strategy in 2004 and 2008, because he really starts that on the national level with that speech, even before he's a US Senator, about there's no red states and blue states. So it's incredibly rhetorically effective. The problem is we have a much deeper, more painful history. And I think you see that with the Proud Boys, with white supremacists, with violence that's happening in terms of Kenosha, but also violence, law enforcement violence. Of course, at times there was looting, but most of the protests were nonviolent. Most of the protests, and we saw 20 million people hit the streets, over 5,000 separate demonstrations, including more white people than people of color and the most white people ever, right? So all those things are really important and hopeful and fascinating. But the biggest challenge is that for those 20 million people and people who feel the way they do, and they're saying, look, they want to be committed to anti-racism, they want to build this beloved community. The biggest challenge to that are the democratic structures we have in the United States of America, right? So we need an entire reinvention. So that's different from saying, well, you want to throw out the Declaration of Independence and throw out the Constitution. I'm not saying that, but for instance, let me just think about women for a second. The Equal Rights Amendment was never passed, right? So even as they do Lilly Ledbetter and all this piecemeal stuff, I think it's an outrage that the Equal Rights Amendment was never passed. So you need a mechanism where you say, look, something like that, it absolutely has to be the status quo, whether it's somehow a constitutional amendment, but there. Voting rights, right? You need voting rights across all 50 states that everyone recognizes in a uniform way. We need to end, 5-year sentences, felony convictions for voter fraud. Very few people will ever commit voter fraud. And the very fact that you can threaten them with that is anti-democratic, right? In our society. So there's just a ton of things we have to do, from tax policy to the criminal justice system, prisons, reimagining public safety. So I think that the positive of this year is that that's all in the air. The negative, as we've seen, as we've tried to vote this year, and I voted early a week ago, and spent over 2 hours in line right at my local Jewish community center too, which is usually really, really quick. It's over 2 hours, right? Is that we've got real problems. So on the one hand, you've got groups of people who actually non-violently, peacefully want change. On the other, you've got deeply entrenched uh, structures that are controlled by, let's face it, people with wealth. We can say we have an oligarchy in the United States, but then we also have a US military, and we have 18,000 police departments, 800,000 law enforcement that act as a military domestically, that are really not in favor of some kind of radical social justice change and transformation. So in a lot of ways, if you're an American and you're deeply invested in history, right now you're trapped. They told you the lies they tell you about American exceptionalism is that Cuba and Central America and South America, we're so racist, we call them banana republics, right? That's what he said, because their biggest export were bananas. And we said, this is not real. It's all just for show. It's not, the people aren't free. It's authoritarian rule. It's dictators. And you look at our country, and what do you see? You see authoritarian rule. You see real state sanctioned violence, right? You see the police physically assaulting demonstrators. You see the police killing Black people, right? And so you say, well, what's the difference between this place and that place? You see a judiciary that's held hostage by the whims of different political parties, right? Right. And so in a lot of ways, I think the profound nature of this year, the reckoning, is that I think a lot more people realize that, and then it becomes, well, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? Because this is very, very difficult. This is the stakes are very high. We can see it. The stakes are very high, and we have elections in terms of partisanship. This was the worst fear of the founders, where people are provoking and trying to inspire violence at the polls, right? And you demonize. One of the things that Dr. King said was that we couldn't do enemy politics. And certainly, I think both sides treat each other as enemies, but there's one side that obviously has ratcheted up the rhetoric way beyond anything we've ever seen in modern times, right? So yeah, that's what I would say about the Democratic Project. But I'm hopeful. I think this year is very, very hopeful, but I think it's going to be very, very difficult. And it's not just the work of one lifetime. It's the work of many, many different lifetimes. But again, we have achieved change. In the early 20th century, you could send children off to coal mines, and young Black people and white kids were dying in the West Village in fires in shirt factories, who were 8, 9, 10 years old, and they were peeling those children's bodies from explosions in the United States. And right now in 2020, that's not prevalent. Just young people working in factories, and at least in this country. Obviously, globally, it is a problem, actually. So things do change. Things can change. So can we get to a better space and place? Yes, I believe so. But right now, no, that Democratic project is imperiled. And again, we were never as great as Barack Obama implied, although I understand why he said that. Like, saying that was a winning strategy. You can't say what he said now because people just won't believe it. But in that period, it was a winning strategy.
Thank you. Shahryar, you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thanks for being here, Dr. Joseph. My name is Shahryar. I'm a dual degree student in public health and public affairs. And so I'm doing my public health coursework now. I'll start my LBJ coursework next year. And so, I attended this talk because I had a question for you in terms of bringing, social and racial justice to the public health kind of area and field, especially in the case of Texas. What do you see in the future for that? Do you think there's much hope for, policy change at the state level in terms of public health and, doing something from the top down in our structures versus something that's more community based, something that might be, done separately within Texas, or something that's top down? And I kind of wanted to get your opinion on what you think could work best. What are some, critiques and analysis that you've heard, and overall, just your opinion on the kind of situation about it?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think Well, yes, I think there's hope for change. I think you need both and in terms of, especially with the work you're doing. Um, uh, with the center, we've had students who are connected to Dell. I'd love to partner with Dell again, but Dell is important in that sense. Certainly, the way Dell is configured, even though they have a diversity dean, just in terms of supply chains, it's overwhelmingly white, right? And so part of the job of folks like you who are in that space would be to how can we use these resources, and how can right now we have a new president of the school, and I've met the dean at the Dell School, Clay, um, who I think would be receptive to this. But what are they doing, and how whatever work they are doing that can be amplified in the space of public health and racial justice, right? Both on the east side of Austin, but wherever Black communities are, especially in Travis County. I think Texas, you're right about Texas and potential top down. It's going to depend on this election. It's going to depend on this election. We have a Black legislative caucus that's ready to do big things, but it really depends on this election, because really everything's the ledge. The governor doesn't have as much power as people think, because the state's constitution has never been rewritten. We might be the only state in the United States whose state constitution has um, never been rewritten and updated to expand powers of the governor. So there's a number of things that we can think about, though, in terms of public health. One is, we've got here at UT the Division for Diversity and Community Engagement, that has tried to do a lot in the sector of the historic East Side, and trying to um, think about public health and equity on the East Side, because the East Side is the result of the city's 1928 master plan that mandated racial segregation. Eric Tang and folks at IUPRA, Institute for Urban Policy and Research, have done a lot of great stuff on this that you can find online. And over the last 20 years, I know there's a 10-year period where Eric Tang looked at one block where, white representation on the block increased by 444% or something. So that is a public health issue. The fact that so many Black and brown folks have to leave because they can't afford a neighborhood that's gentrifying, and a neighborhood that's not going to have food deserts anymore, a neighborhood that's going to have good schools and have all this investment, and they have to leave because of property taxes, or they're in dilapidated areas, is really, a shame and a scandal, right? Public health is connected to not just things like gun violence, but also having access to the University of Texas, having access to quality education, having access to quality food, and having access to desegregated spaces that are connected to safety as well. So I think one of the things that the city council just passed with the 5% reduction in AIS in Austin and APD was to get new ambulances and new non-lethal first responders. And that's a big part of what a movement for Black lives has been calling for in terms of public health. So you think about the connection between public health and public safety in bigger ways, and it means that your investments and your spending should not be concentrated. That basically what it means is the smallest part of your public safety spending should be on lethal first responders. That's what it means. And the largest part should be on non-lethal first responders. And that's a huge public health component. Certainly, I think language-wise, I understand why activists are calling it defund the police, but I think language-wise, to try to build consensus in the democracy that we have, which is really flawed, I've been calling it reimagining public safety, because I think it gives people a better understanding of what people mean by that. And I also think it then reduces the fear, because you really can't, and it's really fear of from white people, but then there's some Black people who'd have the fear too, and people of color, you've set up a world here in the United States where there's so much fear of Black people and so much fear of Black criminality. Just the presence of one Black person, one Black face in neighborhoods throughout Texas and the United States causes panic and causes people to call the police, causes people to run. So when you say defund the police, that feeds into that fear. I've had conversations and debates with some hardcore activists about it. You know, they disagree with me, and I understand why. They're saying that, you know, indigenous folks have the right to define their movement for themselves and the terminology for themselves. So, and as a historian, I can tell you that when people said they were abolitionists of racial slavery, people pushed back against them just like to defund the police. So I do want to tell you that for white people, saying that you're for more justice, especially, it's both white people, but also when white women talked about suffragism, they were pushed back against, like it was defund the police, you know, and let alone Black women talking about voting rights and feminism. So I definitely do think that there is never a perfect, if you say, look, I want to end racism against Asian Americans and Native Americans and Black people, there's always going to be a ton of people who are offended. Okay, that's the whole thing, you know, including sometimes people even within those groups. I mean, one of the interesting data points of the current president is the number of white women, about 53%, that voted for him. So more white women voted for the current president than Hillary Clinton. So you could see that whatever fears that we have that then translate into policy, very deep for us in this country, really, really deep, in ways that I think other people find it inexplicable to understand. Like, why don't people get together in common cause for over class or over gender or over race? And it's like, well, in a lot of ways, there are deeper cleavages than that. You know, those are cleavages, but then there are even deeper cleavages than that in terms of like our identity here in the United States. So yeah, I think public health is huge. And by the time you come back and you're taking LBJ stuff, it would be great to do something with the Center on Public Health and to utilize your expertise in that area. And, you know, race and public health, I'll close by saying, is a huge, huge, you know, discipline now. You know, on the history side, there's always been great books like Medical Apartheid, Infectious Fear, books not just on Tuskegee and the syphilis, but books on just the medical committee of the civil rights movement during the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC days, Freedom Summer and public health. You know, we had over 1,000 white volunteers come to Mississippi in 1964, including public health experts, you know, including public health experts. So, and obviously poverty is a public health crisis, which we haven't talked about since the Great Society. And we lost out on the Great Society through another public health crisis, which is war, which is what Dr. King talked about, right? Vietnam. If only we didn't go into Vietnam, you know. But remember, we'd have needed a Congress to spend the same money on Vietnam at home for 10 years. And would they have done that? And that's what I'm saying. That's why this democracy, it's really tough. And that's why some people go in a whole other direction and say that, you know, they want a revolution and they want it, you know, now, right? And you can really see why people have said that historically. I disagree with the tactics, but I'm saying you have to contextualize, well, why? What's the desperation that leads people to say we want to actually a violent overthrow of the status quo? And I think we're all, even those of us who have relative privilege, we're seeing that desperation manifests itself. Doesn't mean that that's the way to go. I would argue it's actually not, but you can see why, because it's very difficult to change these longstanding institutions, and their inherent vulnerabilities are now being exploited in not just anti-democratic ways, but in authoritarian ways. You know, and I think that we're seeing that crisis unfold before us, and we don't have really a great toolkit to end this. We really don't, you know. And even if irrespective of whoever anybody's voting for, if there is a change in administration, that it's not going to be like this grand slam home run where suddenly you get this massive reset, because the same forces that led to this current administration are still very, very much alive uh, and well within our democracy. And that's the thing. You get part of being in a democracy is you can be in a democracy where there are people who don't believe in democracy, and part of democracy is allowing um, those voices to be heard. You know, yeah. So it can. That's why some folks don't understand democracy and say, "How come?" You know. I remember Vladimir Putin used to tell George W. Bush, who they were buddies, different kind of buddies than him and this current president. But he used to say, "Why don't you just run for a third term?" And he's trying to tell him that constitutionally he couldn't, right? He's like, just do it, just do it. And that's what obviously eventually Putin did, right? He was president, then he was prime minister, and then he's like, just throw everything out. I'm just president for life, basically, right? Yeah.
Professor Joseph, do you have enough time to take one more question? Christina had her hand up.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Now.
Hi, Dr. Joseph. I actually have to run at 1 o'clock, but I wanted to ask about, so I read your book, The Sword and the Shield, over the summer, and I really enjoyed it. And I was wondering if you think that there's any space in academia, in higher ed, for more of Malcolm X's approach to social justice, because I feel like maybe MLK's approach is a lot more common. I mean, we even have a statue of MLK, right? But like, yeah. I don't know if I've seen a lot of statues of Malcolm X.
No, not in Harlem. You might, but not in Texas. Yeah, I think at this moment, Christina, I think this is the moment where you could have that. I think that this summer, starting May 25th, and you saw it in all of our, whether you were watching ESPN or you were watching any kind of cultural, pop cultural context, so many people were talking about the experiences that they've had and saying how they needed deep-seated change, but we're really calling out these structures and even naming names. I think one of the things that Malcolm is so good at is being such a bold truth teller about the depth and breadth of racism and racial injustice in America, and wanting us to move past, myths and lies of American exceptionalism to try to embrace and, James Baldwin says, begin again, so because once you get past, and we've all done things in our past where we lied to ourselves, and really you needed to stop the lie to move on to a new point, like really, whether it's like you're not walking the talk of who you claim to be, eventually it comes back. Eventually, Malcolm called it chickens coming home to roost. So yeah, I think the Academy, we have so much work to do, because we can be an engine of equity, but we get caught up in so much petty division. We are reflective of the larger society with our sexism and our racism, our queer phobia, transphobia, just all of it. But so much of it is just deeply rooted in white supremacy, and it becomes, how do you call that out? And I think these professional schools, it's even more difficult than when you're in the arts and sciences. This is the first policy school I've been in, and I've always been in history departments, Black studies departments, and these professional schools are even more difficult and entrenched, because you have folks who consider themselves practitioners, scholars too, but practitioners, and they're not necessarily interested or empathetic to what we're seeing happen all around us. Although people now have to give a kind of lip service to it because it's become the biggest thing, So I do think that, an approach, by any means necessary approach, is certainly called for. But again, the Academy, as you know, is very, very conservative. These are conservative institutions, and Texas has been around. Can somebody tell me what the founding date of UT is? What the founding date? what's our founding date? Like the founding date.
It looks like September 15th, 1883.
So 1883. And so, and Christina, I know you have to leave your TAing. So that means we let the first Black student on campus 77 years after our founding, or 67 years after our founding. And then the first undergraduate 73 years after our founding. And then, you know, facilities and stuff was still segregated deep into the late 60s, early 70s, right? So that's really unbelievably problematic. Yeah, every student here at UT doesn't have to take a course on just our own history of racial segregation, you know, which includes athletics, which includes, they don't have to, right? And then we're wondering, you know, why is all this stuff happening, right? And so, and Texas, of course, had the textbooks that called enslaved Black folks workers. So they were workers, you know, it's like you're signing your contracts and getting, you're getting the good benefits from the Steve Jobses of the 19th century, right? Maybe they had iPhones too, these workers, you know, these workers in Texas. So yeah, I think that approach, and we certainly are going to have more people pushing for more and more equity in higher education. The contrast and the contradiction is the fact that the pandemic and the massive unemployment is leading to, UT hasn't done this, which I'm very happy about, but really stark budget calls moving forward. You know, we're going to be all in for, we're in for it moving forward.
Professor Joseph, thank you so much for joining us today. I think we've
Thank you.
run to the end of our course here, and thank you all for your thoughtful questions.
Yeah, my last, you know, I'm not teaching in the spring, but I teach courses. I'll be back in the fall, but I teach courses on mass incarceration, race and mass incarceration, the civil rights movement and public policy, on Black politics, on the Black Power movement, on African-American intellectual history, and Barack Obama as well. So, and probably we'll be teaching something on just, you know, what's happened this year, this last, you know, because it's been really fascinating. I'm still writing a bunch on it too, and it'll be interesting to see what the outcome is of the election is, and how we move forward from there, you know, irrespective of the outcome, you know.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.